I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. In a bit of a good news, bad news situation, San Antonio's overall crime rate has decreased to its lowest level in at least 3 decades. However, it still remains the highest among the nation's 15 largest cities, including Houston, Dallas, and Austin. San Antonio Express News staff writer Emilie Eaton joins us here on the program once again to discuss this data and what it means for Alamo City. So, Emilie, great to have you back here on the program. Let's start first with the data itself. Where does it come from, and what are the broad findings for San Antonio?
First of all, thank you for having me, Chance. And so to get right into the data, this came from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, which has been in existence for a couple of decades now. It tracks, we have data dating back to 1985 for all types of crimes in San Antonio, or the 8 crimes that the FBI deems the most serious. So that includes crimes like homicide, robbery, aggravated assault, rape, and some property crimes like burglary, grand theft auto, arson, things along that nature. So this data comes from the FBI, and they release it every year in September.
So, as I mentioned, Emilie, some good news, but a bit of a mixed bag as well. What are the reasons behind this 30-year low in crime in San Antonio, or at least what are the experts saying about it?
You know, Chance, it's really hard to say. So I have been covering homicides since I first got here in 2016. And that year actually was one of the highest homicide levels we'd seen in 21 years. And at the time, I called dozens of experts, both here in Texas and nationally. And I talked to the police department, and they all sort of said, we don't know, which is a really frustrating answer for a journalist, because we want to know, and I'm assuming the public wants to know, why are these levels increasing and in this case decreasing? Some of the reasons that a lot of experts cite are some of the socioeconomic factors like unemployment rates, concentrated poverty, things along that line. There are also some much debated reasons. Some people cite things like access to abortion services, which is really, as you can imagine, controversial. And then there's some other things in terms of police community relations and police staffing levels that often get cited. So to answer your question, they don't know, but they are exploring a number of reasons.
And I know specifically in your write-up that's available at expressnews.com, some experts are kind of open about the fact that sometimes things happen and there might not be a specific reason they can point to.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Sometimes they say stats increase and decrease and there is no reason behind it.
So moving along, we've been talking about this general crime drop that's been the lowest level in at least 3 decades. Once again, a mixed bag, though. San Antonio is still the highest out of the 15 largest cities in the U.S. So you have that general crime data, and then you can break it down along more specific lines, something like violent crime. That's a different indicator than just crime in itself. So how is violent crime in San Antonio measured in the last few years? I know specifically you just mentioned how recently we've kind of had an outlier year specifically for something like homicides.
Yes. So in 2016, which is actually a year prior to the data that was released this week, the violent crime increased dramatically, and we saw one of the highest homicide levels that we've ever seen, as I mentioned earlier. This year, or the last year that the data is available for 2017, which was released this week, violent crime actually decreased by 1%, which is good news, but it's still higher than it was 32 years ago. So if you look at the per capita rate, which is the number of crimes per 100,000 people or 100,000 residents, there were 707 violent crimes in 2017 compared to 625 in 1985. So it's good news and bad news. Our homicide rate went down, our violent crime rate went down, but it's still, in terms of violent crime, higher than it was 30 years ago.
And as you just mentioned, per capita or per resident, people call San Antonio Military City. You might also call it move-in city. It's kind of like as more people move to the area, you might still have roughly the same amount of crimes of a certain kind that are taking place, but the rate goes down because there's more people.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And that's why it's so important to do these per capita calculations. Because initially, when you look at the data, there were something like 10,700 violent crimes reported. It's actually the highest number of violent crimes ever reported in San Antonio. But you think about the fact that our city has been growing so much, and you look at it per capita, and it turns out that it's actually not quite that bad. Of course, it's still not great, but it's not the highest it's been in 32 years.
So we've gone over a few of the more in-depth statistics, as well as just talked about the general crime rate. Once again, we're at a 3-decade low. But what else have you learned from this FBI Uniform Crime Reporting Program data?
So one thing we haven't touched on that actually I think affects a lot of residents, or hopefully not a lot, but some, is property crime. Violent crime gets a lot of the focus because, of course, it is violent and no one wants to see these things happen in our communities. But property crime happens with a lot more frequency. And we jumped into that data and we found that property crime actually decreased 7% from the year prior, and it too is at its lowest level since 32 years. So sort of for perspective, there were 4,800-ish property crimes per 100,000 residents, which is significantly lower than it was in the 1980s when it was as high as 12,000.
And just a refresher, Emilie, what exactly do you mean by property crime? And you're right. I think when it comes to crime, unless, something really unfortunate happens to someone and they become a statistic and it's a very horrible situation, I think a lot of people, day in and day out, they might run into crime when it comes to their property.
You're absolutely correct, Chance. So property crimes includes burglary, larceny theft, motor vehicle theft, and arson.
To go back to this data, though, Emilie, obviously you can learn a lot from it, but, no study, no statistic is perfect. So what are some of the drawbacks or maybe things that should be considered when using this data to describe, crime in San Antonio or comparing the city with other large cities across the U.S.?
That's a great question, Chance. So the San Antonio Police Department really doesn't like when we do these comparisons and we compare San Antonio to other cities. And experts actually advise against it as well, because the Uniform Crime Reporting Program is not mandatory by law. So San Antonio, for example, or any other jurisdiction would not face any sanctions or any penalties for not submitting this data. It's completely voluntary, which means when you're comparing city to city, the comparison may not be always 100% accurate. It's also difficult because each jurisdiction classifies crime their own way. So in one city, it might be an aggravated assault, but in another city, it might be an assault. So it wouldn't be included in this data. So police departments and experts say, it's really not a great idea to compare city to city. That being said, why we continue to do this is because there is nothing else. This is a lot of departments report to this program, including most big cities that we compare to, like Houston or Dallas or Phoenix or San Diego. So we do know that those police departments are reporting the data. We hope they're doing it correctly, like San Antonio is. And we really want to know, I think people still want to know how we compare to other cities. So that's why we continue to do it.
That all being the case, Emilie, has there been any news from the San Antonio Police Department regarding this latest release of data that came out this week?
No, they haven't said anything, but I imagine they're very happy to see crime decrease. They have been trying very hard since homicides and violent crime spiked in 2016 to really address crime in our communities. So they created a violent crime task force in the beginning of 2017, which is a collaboration with several federal and state partners. And they've really touted that task force for its success. They say that they've targeted a lot of gang activity through that task force that has contributed to this decrease. So they haven't said much, but I'm sure that they are pleased to see their efforts paying off.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that's something that Police Chief McManus has specifically mentioned in the past regarding crime is gang activity.
Yes. So at first, when we first reported violent crime at the end of 2016, early 2017, the police department was very tight-lipped about what caused it. They said they didn't know. And we, again, talked to so many experts, and gang activity is often brought up, or drug activity, or just being acquaintances with someone that is involved in criminal activity is often brought up as a reason for increases in violent crime. And the police department mentioned that vaguely, but they were like, well, we don't have a gang problem and we really don't know. It's too soon to tell. But as time went on and as this task force developed, it really seemed like they took a focus on gang activity specifically. I think they would still be hesitant to say we have a problem, but I think just the fact that this has been a focus for them shows that gang activity is somewhat prevalent in our communities.
Sure. Yeah. Read between the lines, the programs that you just mentioned. It seems obvious that at least it is a priority for the police department. We have a few moments left. Emilie, any final thoughts or anything that we haven't quite discussed yet regarding this data that we can mention before we say goodbye?
Yeah, I think one thing that is sort of interesting, a lot of people who don't live in San Antonio don't get to look at their specific communities. If you live in Alamo Heights or Olmos Park or Leon Valley. And what's really great about this data is it gives us access to every single town that reports it. So we looked at 30 cities in the San Antonio area with populations over 1,000. And we found that over half of them, that their area's violent crime had increased. And granted, it's still very small numbers. It's nothing like it is in San Antonio or other big jurisdictions like Houston or Dallas. But it is interesting that crime is beginning to sort of spread out to some of our smaller communities as well.
And thanks to San Antonio Express News staff writer Emilie Eaton for joining me for today's episode of In Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.